In our story today, we're going to continue. We're going to continue onward by kicking both the civil rights movement and the Cold War into high gear by looking at civil rights in the 1950s and the transition of the Cold War into the 1960s. So, civil rights had been somewhat stagnant for quite some time. We had seen significant gains for African Americans socially, some gains economically, but as far as legal gains for African Americans, we really haven't seen much since the end of Reconstruction in all reality, with most of the decisions being setbacks, things like Plessy v. Ferguson, legally establishing segregation, etc. So the Supreme Court case, obviously, there's a whole bunch of stuff that leads up to this, but the climatic moment in the fight to kick off the civil rights movement is the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka case. You're, of course, hopefully aware of it. There's a museum over by downtown that you should 100% go check out if you have the opportunity. Brown v. Board is an amalgamation of a number of different cases, the goal being to find a test case that was willing to challenge the Plessy v. Ferguson rule of separate but equal, specifically targeting segregated schools. And so this was a case that was pushed. The goal, of course, was to find a number of different, somewhat sympathetic regions. So there were not going to be you're not going to challenge segregated schools in Alabama, obviously, because there's very little chance of success. And so in the somewhat border areas, there were a number of different cases that were all rolled together into this one Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. This was, in a very real sense, an attempt to sort of push forward civil rights legislation because although some presidents, Harry Truman, for example, commissioned a report called To Secure These Rights, as you see here, which basically laid out an agenda for civil rights. But then, because of the whole Southern revolt in the election of 48, all of this was shelved, and African American advocates began to think that like relying on legislative solutions was probably not going to work. And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is still incredibly important, fighting for pushing for test cases and trying to promote equality through judicial rulings, made this sort of concerted push to come up with a series of sympathetic test cases. And the person most associated with this is Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the key lawyers for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and would eventually be the first African American Supreme Court justice. Of course, hopefully you know the result. You should understand again that they specifically chose Topeka and a number of other places because they felt like they could get sympathetic rulings there. And the Brown v. Board decision strikes down segregation by arguing that separate but equal is inherently unequal by making the people who are being separated lesser. And so this is one of the most important Earl Warren, who's the Chief Justice, Supreme Court rulings, because of course it sets this precedent that segregation is now not okay, which of course allows you to challenge if segregation is not legal in public schools, it opens the door to challenge segregation across the board in a variety of other places and areas. Obviously, the South was relatively unhappy with this. We can see a number of very well thought through signs and some very friendly individuals wrapping themselves in the American flag in order to preserve white supremacy. And so the problem, of course, is once the Supreme Court ruled this, you still have to enforce it. And there was real questions about enforcement throughout the South and honestly throughout the North, but mostly throughout the South, because this was a strike against legal segregation. For example, the governor of Alabama, a guy named George Wallace, you should remember him. He's going to come back around. Famously stood in the door with the National Guard to block, stand stood in the door of the schoolhouse to forbid entry. And the case in which, of course, the case that became famous here, and that hopefully you read about in the documents, is the Little Rock Nine. Uh, in Little Rock, Arkansas, there was very significant pushback and significant resistance to this Supreme Court ruling, specifically by Governor Orville Faubus. Here's Faubus. Yeah. Uh, and so, in order to challenge this ruling, the newly desegregated Little Rock Central High School, at Little Rock Central High School, a number of African American students enrolled. And you get this situation where the governor Faubus basically decides that he's going to ban African Americans from attending this school, arguing that it's a safety concern. So what you end up getting is a governor violating a Supreme Court order, which finally stirred the Eisenhower administration to act. And so for the rest of the school year, the National Guard was called out, and these African American students were escorted to class day in and day out, which obviously was very distracting and problematic. And I'll be posting some documents to supplement this because what these students went through to try to push for change is utterly unbelievable, and it took an amazing amount of courage and yeah, and the strength to go through with this whole thing. So, and obviously, there's still significant pushback from Orville Faubus and other pro-segregationists in the South. And the end result of this is the South ends up finding a loophole around this issue by basically closing all of the public schools. So the South starts shutting down their public schools, creating private schools with vouchers for white students, which the federal government cannot force to, or has not forced to integrate, and then reopening the public schools as underfunded, again, resegregated schools, but segregated again by custom, not by law. And so, although Brown v. Board struck down legal segregation in schooling, uh, segregation based on neighborhood balance and things like that is still legal. And so, the end result is citizens' councils would be set up in order to basically continue to reinforce the status quo. And even in the North, what you ended up getting is citizens' councils that forced kept neighborhoods segregated by practice by basically just being racist to any African American who showed up in order to keep schools segregated. And so northern schools were as not legally segregated, but in real terms, we're still segregated during this time period. The Montgomery bus boycott, I'll post some documents about this, but we're going to go through this one relatively quickly because I'm hoping you're familiar with this. This was an attempt to desegregate public transportation in Montgomery. And so this is the famous Rosa Parks case, where Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat on a bus and chose not to. The interesting piece about this to me is you always sort of have this story of Rosa Parks just being fed up with it all, which of course she was. But she was also very specifically looking for an opportunity to challenge, to break this law, this segregationist law, so she could get arrested, so they could make a case out of it and rally around her. And so once Rosa Parks refused to get up off the bus, African American leaders started organizing a boycott. Again, I'll post documents about this by details, but for almost a year, they organized carpool clubs. They bent over backwards, basically have no African Americans ride the public buses in Montgomery. This is where we get a young minister from Atlanta, a guy named Martin Luther King Jr., arriving on the scene with the Montgomery bus boycott. And so they put economic pressure on the city of Montgomery and eventually forced them to fold. The city of Montgomery then desegregated public transit, which was seen as a huge victory for integrationists. And it propelled Martin Luther King Jr. and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference to the forefront of civil rights action. And so what you're seeing is both legal challenges to segregation in things like Brown v. Board and economic challenges to segregation through the Montgomery bus boycott. And these are the two of the methods that the civil rights movement, once it really gets started in the 1960s, is going to go back to time and again to try to force integration. So, MLK, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and nonviolent resistance is the other way. And so, with the idea being that the stronger that the authorities attempt to reinforce the status quo, the more public support and sympathy the integrationists gain. And so you get in stuff like this with the police, peaceful marchers being attacked by police dogs, which builds public support and puts pressure on segregationists to change and reform. This strategy again would be used by Martin Luther King Jr., modeled somewhat after Gandhi's resistance to the British in the aftermath of World War II. And we'll come back to this in future lectures as the civil rights movement grows and evolves and targets a whole series of other parts of society. The election of 1960, there was Eisenhower, of course, served his 2 terms. He's a beloved president, but the Republicans, once they took back over Congress in the 1950s, passed an amendment that banned a president for serving more than 2 terms. So it enshrined Washington's custom into law because, of course, they didn't want to see another FDR. So after two terms, Eisenhower's done, plus his health was failing. But it's obviously time for Eisenhower's right hand man and America's greatest champion, Richard Nixon, to show up on the scene. And so Nixon, it's finally time for Nixon to run for president in 1960. Generally considered a front runner. He's obviously Eisenhower's VP. Strong foreign policy, strong anti-communism. You know, who wouldn't love Richard Nixon? And so the Republicans are going to nominate Vice President Richard Nixon, whereas the Democrats are going to go with a sort of young outlier, a guy named Jack Kennedy. We're going to spend some time talking to. So we're going to spend some time talking about just very briefly. Kennedy was young. He was handsome. He was from Boston, from a wealthy political family, and he was Catholic, which was really problematic at this time. And so he was seen as somewhat of a risky choice. Although he's an up and coming political star in the Democratic Party. Of course, in order to balance the ticket, you need a white Southerner, and so we get Lyndon Johnson on the ticket to help deliver the solid South, hopefully to Kennedy, by theoretically saying the right things in order to appease Southern Democrats. And this was really in the 1960s, everything was in terms of the Cold War. This idea that we need to get ahead of the Russians, we need change and progress in order to try to push ourselves ahead of the Soviet Union and theoretically win the Cold War. So the election of 1960 is somewhat about priorities, with again Nixon, both sides being anti-communism, Nixon being more of a traditional Republican, Kennedy coming up with this whole new frontier thing, where he was basically proposing, some level of New Deal style programs that weren't totally articulated to anybody. But what 1960 was really about, beyond even all of that stuff, is television. Because this is the first majorly televised debate. We'll spend some time talking about television here, or we've already spent some time talking about television here, but a television is going to change the way that we view politics because this was the first ever televised debates. And I'm going to post some footage of this, but the short of it is Kennedy looked amazing on television and Nixon looked sweaty and uncomfortable. And so there's a lot of other details here, but there were a series of televised debates which really turned American public opinion, where people who just listened to the debates assumed that Nixon had come out ahead, and people who watched the debates really thought Kennedy came out ahead. So I'll post some footage of this, but you should absolutely watch Kennedy versus Nixon. End result, incredibly close election. Kennedy loses some of the segregationist states who think he might be too soft on civil rights. Nixon, man, I mean, it's we're talking within 100,000 votes here, so incredibly close. And Kennedy ends up winning, a bare majority of the electoral college and becoming president of the United States. The election of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1960 ushered in a new age of hope and youth to the United States. Kennedy was incredibly young. He brought with him a bunch of young, really bright Ivy League, advisors who felt like they were really going to change and remake the direction of American society and push us into this decade. Kennedy and his family himself were also young and they were beautiful and they projected this sense of youthful exuberance and there were children in the White House and it was just a very different feel from Eisenhower, who's of course much older and much more traditional. Of course, Kennedy's wife, Jackie, was beautiful and fashionable, and was a trendsetter, and helped redefine American womanhood for this new generation. Of course, the fact that this was all illusion, that Kennedy had multiple affairs, there were all these issues, wasn't really important because no one focused on that. Instead, the outward veneer of Kennedy's White House, which was referred to as Camelot, as if it were some mythical court, back in the Middle Ages, really defined the perception of the Kennedys and this new sort of generation. Kennedy also tried to change American policy, focusing on Latin America by trying to create more positive connections. Obviously, went on a goodwill tour of Latin America to try to support our allies and push back against encroaching communism. Of course, Kennedy had inherited the Cuban situation, and so we want to keep the rest of Latin America firmly on the side of the First World. And he created the Alliance for Progress, which created economic links between Latin America and the United States, or stronger economic links. And Kennedy founded the Peace Corps, which allowed young, idealistic Americans to go abroad to the third world to spread goodwill and the gospel of capitalism, push back against the rising totalitarian communist threat. So it was this sense of hope and optimism, which honestly didn't last all that far into Kennedy's term because the whole Cuba thing is really going to blow up. I'll post some videos to this, so I'm just going to give the briefest overviews of this Cuba situation. But Kennedy inherits a lot of the Cuba problems, a lot of the problems of Cuba from Eisenhower. He goes ahead with the Bay of Pigs invasion, sort of halfway, and ends up totally botching it. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an attempt by the U.S. government to arm Cuban refugees, land them on the island, and then start a general insurrection to overthrow Fidel Castro. It fails miserably because air support doesn't materialize. I've read a number of different reasons why the air support doesn't materialize. But basically, these rebels are captured on the beach immediately, massively humiliated, and the invasion fails. The US tries a series of almost cartoonishly ridiculous ways to kill Castro, including like sending him a bottle of poisoned rum. And I believe they also sent him a box of exploding cigars. These almost Sunday morning cartoon style assassination attempts fail, and Castro is still sitting there. So Castro begins feeling increasingly nervous and wants more support from the Soviet Union, which kicks off the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, I'll post documents to this. It's an incredibly dramatic moment in American history that I'm going to breeze through, unfortunately. But the Cuban Missile Crisis involves a U.S. spy plane flying over Cuba. They see the beginnings of the creation of intercontinental ballistic missile sites, mid range ballistic missile sites. So the Soviet Union is installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is obviously incredibly terrifying for us because, as you can see, these missiles can hit most of the urban areas within the United States, right? So if Cuba has these missiles, this, like our warning time from a Soviet nuclear attack could go from hours to minutes, right? And so there's really no way to respond to nuclear missiles being launched from Cuba. So, and of course, the vast majority of the American population would now be under direct threat of immediate annihilation from these missiles. So, obviously, this will not stand, and so a rising crisis emerges as Kennedy orders a blockade, an embargo of the island, in order to prevent the Soviets from bringing in the key components to bring these missiles online. And so what ends up happening, it's a staring match between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Both sides, obviously, if they start fighting, this could build out of either side's control. And so you've got Soviet ships heading towards an American blockade, and the tension continues to rise. And it's at this point that we start to realize that like we don't really have good solutions for this because our basic atomic blitzkrieg plan is if war happens, we obliterate everything. And then the Soviets obliterate everything, and then everyone dies, which is fine as long as it's acting as a deterrent, right? With the understanding being that under no circumstances will this happen. But if the Soviets refuse to back down, if we refuse to back down, and the ships meet and they start firing, at what point do we just nuke the world? And so they end up setting up a series of back channel talks and they end up de escalating this crisis. But this is the closest we ever came to nuclear annihilation. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis ends up diffusing and being a non historical event. But it is super important because it makes us realize that this sense of brinksmanship, this idea that we need to be always prepared to go into war, that John Foster Dulles articulated in the 50s here. What happens if it actually happens? We realize that like this could actually happen, and if it does, the entire world blows up, and this is probably not ideal. And so we set up a series of safeguards to prevent something like this from happening again. First of all, we establish a direct communication line between Moscow and Washington, because Kennedy and Khrushchev were relying on very unreliable methods of communicating, which could lead to miscommunications and could potentially destroy the world. So the hotline is set up. We start putting bans on nuclear missile testing and start negotiating nuclear treaties. And we agree secretly as part of this settlement to remove our missiles from closer to the Soviet Union in order to slow down or to stop our ability to have this sort of instantaneous first strike. And we start communicating, as we said, better. And we come up with this idea of flexible response, where we come up with a variety. The United States starts developing a series of responses that are not all out war. So we start developing, for example, much more precision guided weapons as opposed to relying on the huge nuclear bombs that we had previously. And we developed new groups of elite forces like the Green Berets, which could go in and do very specific missions that would theoretically not rise to the level of total war. And so we start recommitting ourselves to this idea of limited war and intervention, as opposed to the sort of mad and massive retaliation. And so the legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis is one, it almost destroyed the world. Two, honestly, Khrushchev backed down and really saved everyone. And he ends up getting ousted from power because of this. So thank you, Nikita Khrushchev, for not destroying the world. And and in future conflicts, we're going to be much more circumspect about how we handle it. And so in Vietnam, we're going to start slowly putting in U.S. advisors and small numbers of Green Berets. And obviously, eventually, it's going to balloon out of control. So uh, Kennedy's record so far. Foreign policy, I guess they didn't destroy the world, so good on them. Domestic policy, nothing's really happened yet. It's pretty early in the administration. They made some noise about civil rights and that it didn't actually happen. He's going to step up our involvement in Vietnam, as I said earlier. And then Kennedy dies 2 years into his term. I mean, we have this sense of John Kennedy as like this looming massive figure in American public life, but in reality, he didn't serve for all that long. In '63, he's traveling in an open car to Dallas, Texas, when he is assassinated from what we believe is a lone gunman in the went from the window up from the upstairs window of a book depository. Kennedy gets shot. I'll post the footage of it. It's horrific. Here's Jackie Kennedy trying to pick up pieces of her husband's skull from the back of a open limousine. And the reason that there's so many conspiracy theories around the whole Kennedy assassination is the guy who was picked up for the assassination is this guy. This is Lee Harvey Oswald, who's has some ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union. But before we can find out much about him, he is assassinated by a guy named Jack Ruby, who's a Dallas nightclub owner, and then Ruby is found dead in his cell. And so we never really get answers for any of these motivations as far as why Kennedy dies, but he dies incredibly suddenly. Lyndon Johnson is sworn in as president, and the era of the Kennedys, as quickly as it begun, this era of hope and optimism for the 1960s, is slammed shut both through the Cuban Missile Crisis and then the assassination of John Kennedy.